thank you very much to all our speakers for introducing the topic. Of course, we heard more the talks on the policy side and then the technological side. No, I think it's just a bit of background that I wanted to bring up to perhaps introduce. Or shall I, can we switch it off?
No, it's fine. For now, it's fine. Okay. As long as you turn it off when we speak.
Okay. Will you turn the projector off a bit later? So thank you very much for your talks. We heard the policy view in the beginning, and then of course we had some updates on the technology side, especially also relating to the research collaboration that we started, trying to understand each other's problems, etc. And let's get to the discussion side. So I would like to invite the audience to pose some questions to kick things off. Are there questions you would like to?
I have a question basically to ICRC. If I listen to the talk, what we have is, for you, okay, you receive the trust of the people you provide service to, and then you go on the other side and you have, if I use a metaphor, you have this bunch of tech people and who tell you, there are some who tell you, oh, don't trust the operating system and the hypervisor. You have others that say, don't trust the cloud environment. So you have all those people who say, don't trust, but trust us. And so my feeling is also, coming back to the first question that you were asking, is it possible to have a tech-based? In the end, I mean, all those solutions, you still have just pushing, who are you going to have to trust? But you always have, in the end, to trust someone is just trust shifting, okay? You don't have to trust Microsoft, but Intel secure environment. You don't have to trust the hypervisor of VMware, but you have to trust your solution. And looking at all that and looking at the trust that you receive, and as responsible for digital transformation, shouldn't be your effort to say, I try not to use digital as much as possible. And only in worst case scenario, when there is no other option, I will go on digital.
Wow, it's a very good question, and it's like a bit like an onion because one could peel at different elements. Perhaps to start with your last point, and I probably don't have a good answer to your question because it's an excellent question. I think I was last week on a panel of the European Humanitarian Forum, and the question I was asked is, how do you go fully digital? I sort of say, I don't want to go fully digital because I think boots on the ground, you can't digitally visit prisoners or detainees. So you can't probably digitally build trust. I mean, I have been sitting and drinking tea and coffees in tents with non-state armed groups for hours, and it would be the same with states before they actually trust you. More when I started on the operational side of things. So I think the question is, what kind of percentage of how do you create digital proximity? I think physical proximity for us is very important. We don't subcontract our work. That's why we have so many staff. We actually feel we have to go ourselves to the people, to the belligerents, to everybody. And the question is, can we then use physical? Can we use digital? Can we create digital proximity to complement, but not to replace physical proximity? Now, the question on who do you trust, it's a very good one. I think the first one is, I realize that we as humanitarian organizations have to become more tech savvy without being driven by technology, which means in a way the operational reflection nevertheless remains to be central, but we need also to acquire skills and capacities in-house, but also through partnerships that allow us to unpack some of these dilemmas and make decisions that may be questionable. The second point is, how do you then ensure that you make the right decisions? Because at one stage you have to sort of say, do we go for cloud? What kind of data? What do we keep on-prem? Is on-prem actually more dangerous against hacking? Does that really work? I mean, you can't just sort of be in a sort of analysis paralysis. We are an operational agency. We have to get the job done. So you can't just, it's not a purely academic intellectual exercise. You have to get going. But I think what happens, the good experiences we have done in different fields that are probably that we can replicate is, on one hand, I think we have to be very transparent in how we make our choices and how do we hold ourselves accountable. We have very stringent data protection norms that are independently supervised. We have a policy on biometrics that shows what can be done or not. So whoever wants can go to our website and sort of basically say, what do we apply, and challenge us and sort of say, guys, you have totally got it wrong here. And the other thing is, very often, you know, the trust, you figure out pretty fast whether people trust you or not. Hopefully rather that they criticize you than that they shoot at you, but it comes at different sort of degrees of intensity. And I think if you have policy and if you are transparent about how you go about technology, and that means also being transparent once you suffer an attack, as we had, and perhaps transparent on possible errors and omissions and commissions, it allows then the different stakeholders that surround us and fight to come back and challenge us and push us and question us. And it is in a way this sort of being in the middle of all these frictions that hopefully make you eventually land in the best possible place, which is very often the least worst place.
Okay, is there perhaps another response on trust and transparency from any of the other speakers? Of course, Ed.
Yeah, I would like to add a word from a technological viewpoint, I think. In a sense, I fully agree with the concern. So you should not have to trust the cloud provider or the technology provider or the software developer for when using their work or their capabilities. So a big part of what we do is to try to reduce the technical trust that you really need to put into those operators and those first parties to get the job done. At the same time, I think that relying on a software stack, on some hardware that is used and that is well understood and that is state of the art may, although of course you have to make a strong case for its security, it's much harder to attack or to attack durably than some ad hoc solutions people may be able to do on their own. So I think there is a good case to be made for having efficiencies of scales for performance, for cost, but also for security. It's just that the requirement from us as technology providers is to exactly provide as much transparency and to work hard to reduce the technical trust that people have to make in order to use the services or the products. But when you can reduce it, but it's never going to be perfect. That's at the end there is still an element of trust, and keeping people accountable for what they do is another way to mitigate it. But it's not a technology question. Indeed, that's primarily a policy question.
Any other feedback on trust and transparency? Otherwise, invite other questions. Yes, please. Perhaps I can just give.
So maybe first I want to thank you all for working on these big, hairy goals that are truly, truly purposeful. I found this really motivational and inspiring. I want to congratulate you on that. But as a Swiss open source developer and Swiss policy actor, I have to ask you about what role do you see for Switzerland, right? For Swiss industry, for Swiss policies and government, with our humanitarian tradition, with our fabled neutrality and all of that. What role can we play here locally?
Yeah, I mean, I'll volunteer to answer. I think it's a brilliant question. I will try to give as fair an answer as possible because you can really answer it at the two extremes, right? So on the one hand, Switzerland is ideally suited because it is a neutral country. It is the seat of a large number of UN organizations. It is the seat of ICRC. It has a reputation of trust in specific sectors. That is a very deep reputation of trust. And so in many ways, it is also it is a government that has the trust of its people. If you look at any international ranking, right? Notwithstanding our local debates when it comes to local politics, right? We trust our governments more than other citizens of other countries trust their governments. So That is all of the arguments why we are ideally suited to play a leading role in transparent, trustworthy, privacy by design, digital system. We also have, and this is the bridge with the concern, the complications, we also have a unique way of decentralizing our government called federalism. We apply the subsidiarity principle, which actually is very well suited to a number of technological problems, right? Not every single technological problem falls into sort of a decentralized type of answer, but a number of actual very hard technological problems in recent years have found their way through sort of decentralization. Now, the flip side of this is that we were decentralized in the analog world, right? Federalism is rooted in a decentralized world. And so we actually have a very, very, very hard time coming up with an actual decentralized protocol, right? We have human protocols that allows the different layers of the Swiss administration to work together. They're rooted in the Constitution and in laws. They're not designed for IT exchange, data exchanges, right? So in that sense, we are also objectively very much behind the curve when it comes to digitizing our government and our society, right? So we have both sides. Now, I think it's a matter of political will. There have been a number of recent events that show that now we need to take this stuff seriously. I know you're part of an organization together with the other guy in the back that is advocating for a bigger role for cybersecurity at the national level. I think this is spot on. We will need to be able to operate an infrastructure. We need to think of it as an infrastructure. Switzerland is very good at investing and then operating and improving what it considers to be critical infrastructures. We have a pretty good train system, even though we were quite late in actually having trains in the country, right, for those interested in the history of the SBB or the CFF. But we do today have a good infrastructure because we invest and we treat it as an investment, and we have a model in Switzerland to identify critical infrastructure and invest in them and maintain and constantly upgrade them. Unfortunately, we don't think that IT is one of those, right? And I think that's the open question, is at some point, perhaps we will realize that we need to think about our sovereign infrastructure as a critical infrastructure, the way we have over the past century and a half identified other critical infrastructures. But that jury, I think, is out.
I just wonder, Shweta, because you've worked in the US beforehand, whether you have a particular view on this question regarding what can Switzerland do, what is the local view versus the US?
Yeah, so just for the context, I have been in 4 countries now, different continents, I guess. So India, Singapore, US, and then Switzerland, all of them have very different political, academic leanings. I think, and again, I'm pretty new to ETH, but I do agree with what Ed said is, at least at ETH and both at EPFL, the academic routing is very much in foundational work, right? We want to build the next secure architecture, the next secure internet, the next secure e-voting platform. As I said in my talk, it's very courageous, but the good part is it's encouraged and it's nurtured, which I find very refreshing, right? And I think it also sort of is amplified in the students at both universities that I have interacted with. So in that regard, I think I'm pretty optimistic about the future, right? At least in the digital side of things. The students are smart, they ask the right questions, just like what we saw, right? And they're pretty enthusiastic about contributing to a solid foundation, which again is refreshing. Let me just say that.
Any more? Okay, perhaps wrap up this question here. Is there? Hold on.
Do I need this? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I want to take this question and throw it back at you. I mean, just coming out of the COVID crisis, for example, we could see that obviously we're not good at digitization, right, of the healthcare system and our federal digital competencies are extremely limited. And when you look at the setup of that system, it also immediately becomes clear why, right? Because the team that's responsible for digital transformation is 3 people out of 900. So, you said before 20,000 people, right? 20,000 boots on the ground. So, in order to truly transform such organizations, you need presumably thousands of people that have extremely strong competence in digital. And just speaking, well, that's a hypothesis, right? Ed can disagree, but speaking about, for example, the students here and so on, of course, right, they're all brilliant, but then of course they go to work, many go to work for the companies that are actually 80% to 90% technical talent. So how, what's your survival plan in that sense for ICRC to survive in such a world, unless you go the route that the gentleman here in front of me suggested, which is to basically not do digital at all? Is there realistically an intermediary way?
It's a very interesting question, because we've been discussing how to train up the talent needed on this intersection between technology and policy, because these are very much people that we need. Balthasar, do you have?
No, it's a good question, and perhaps Ed will afterwards help me with it. I think what I realize, I wouldn't now be able to articulate the precise percentage, and I actually have to check that for a future panel discussion. But of course, we invest very important amounts of money into cybersecurity and cyber systems, and including also in some of the policy back up on data protection. So we have quite a robust data protection office, etc. So we do invest in it. But it's an interesting question, because we had exactly this discussion a few weeks ago, where I was wondering in discussions with donors, how many cents per dollar can you actually, as a humanitarian organization, invest in cybersecurity? Well, it would be interesting almost to have a vote in this room. Is it 3? Is it 60? And what is reasonable? What level is reasonable? Should we aspire for the level of a private bank? Should we become almost sort of weapon grade, sort of secret service kind of capacities to defend our data? What is it? And we have the same questions, for instance, with our delegations. Our delegations, we don't have any machine, guns. We aren't armed. We try to convince people not to attack us. So our first inclination would be, you can relatively easily shoot and kill ICRC people. Of course, we have passive defenses. We have but much of it is actually not being attacked in the first place. But where that will end in tomorrow's world, and what the populations, the donors, the governments, the people who support the Red Cross and other organizations, what do you find reasonable in terms of investment? I think the jury is out, and there will be a very interesting question to ask. Now, in terms of skill set, of course, digital upskilling in terms of digital transformation, I could have talked about, is absolutely essential. It's essentially about people, the savviness of people. Now, we have 20,000 people, different generations, different cultures, different degrees, countries that sort of jump certain technology generations and immediately go faster than perhaps some of the traditional, more technologically advanced societies. Extremely interesting. You have a lot of people off-grid. I speak to heads of delegation in Africa, and they say, you with your digital transformation and data stuff. We have massive rural area where there is no connection. Or we introduced, certain ways where people could actually commission the humanitarian relief on tablets in one context. But the people who needed that were essentially elderly people, and often our staff actually had to do the data input upon house visits, because the technology was just not within the reach. So in this sense, I think that the way we use technology will evolve. We cannot not use digital technology. I think that would be a wrong answer to me, but we have to do it responsibly, and we have to do it in a contextualized way and smartly, and try, of course, always to think about the people. Do we manage to attract talent? That's a very good question. I hope I can tell you in 6 to 12 months, because everybody now looks, of course, to beef up cybersecurity, IT specialists. We are in a very competitive, relatively dry market. But what we see in other domains is that a lot of people look for a sense in life that goes beyond making money. And I think there ICSC can perhaps attract sometimes people who come also because they just feel, with all the limits of humanitarian action, that cannot, unfortunately force political solutions to essentially political problems. But we attract astonishingly, I find, motivated and qualified people because of the sense that is behind our mission. And I want to be optimistic that including in the technology and IT field, we will be able to attract brilliant students from ETHZ and EPFL and other universities around the world. But the jury is out and it's very competitive. And I know also that some of the salaries that are being paid for the absolutely high top officials, I mean, as humanitarian organizations, you can't pay that. Thank you.
And maybe just add one thing, also as a member of the Independent Data Protection Commission of ICRC, there's a book outside that I presume is free, right? Which is, it's a thick book, it's the handbook on on data protection and humanitarian action. And it is co-edited by ICRC. It's the second edition. The first edition was the result of a workshop about 3 years ago called War Goes Digital. And it shows the sophistication and the forward-looking aspect of ICRC when it comes to thinking about the importance of the digital landscape for humanitarian action, the role of ICRC within the humanitarian sector in general. And when you think about this, when in 2019 there was this workshop called War Goes Digital, and you say, well, did war goes digital? And if you look at the current war, it's obviously a brutal World War II style war. And at the same time, it is also a digital war. And so to us, and I think to all of us who are thinking about these problems, when we think about the cyberspace, it is, of course, the systems that we operate, right? And ICRC, like every organization, we have there's an ERP system, there's an HR management system, there's a video conferencing system. Many of these things you have to buy. There's no way you build them from scratch, right? But then there are the platforms that we use at times, right? ICRC is present on a number of social media platforms, even though, of course, there's no direct link or quid pro quo between them and the social media platform. But obviously, today you have to be present on these platforms, and yet these platforms are also have their own emergent properties at scale that have had very unfortunate side effects. And so the conversation is not just what we do, what we don't do, and how we do what we do. It is also how do we use other platforms, and how do other platforms impact our work and influence our work. And that conversation is, again, right, that's why at the end of the day we are present here, and that's why the intersection between technology and policy is going to be more important than ever in the future.
Any more responses to this question? Okay, then can I invite more audience questions? Is there anyone else? Okay.
Hi, thank you very much for the very interesting discussion. So I have a question with regards to plausible deniability, both when talking about policy design, but this highly influences how we build software and hardware stacks. And how important is this for an organization like the Red Cross, or how important do you think this might be for other organizations with similar needs?
Who would like to take this question? Shweta, did you want to?
So from a technical standpoint, it's a choice, right? So you can decide if you want to leave a trace behind. For example, in the case of accountability and transparency, you would want this feature where you do leave a trace behind, right? And in fact, it is to help you for plausible deniability, because you say, look, I did all of these things. I never did what you're claiming that I did, right? So it might be used for proving innocence. But it's not an always on feature, right? So you can sort of seek policy advice and say, oh, okay, I don't want to turn this on. So from a technical perspective, it's your choice what you want to do. Now, whether that choice itself says something about your decisions, I think that that's something my colleague here will be more in a good position to answer.
I'll hand that over to our governance. That's practical today.
So I mean, this is a good question. So here's maybe a good example of what people are are asking with respect to plausible deniability, right? If you want to be able to have, let's say on a laptop, right, a portion of your laptop that is encrypted, but you want to make sure that if you're sort of coerced into granting access to your laptop to, I don't know, somebody who holds you hostage, that, there's got to be a way to sort of, hide the fact that you have some encrypted data. It's kind of one of those, it's an interesting challenge, how do you create a system in which you can manage data, hide data at the same time, and, sort of convince the hostage taker that you're sharing transparently what you have on your laptop, but in fact you're hiding all the jewels, right? It's a really interesting chicken and egg technical problem. May or may not have an answer, right? I know that there used to be answers to those in the past. That is less of an issue directly for humanitarian actors themselves, right? Because, as Balthasar said, we are protected by the emblem and by the privileges and immunities that we have. And so the notion of coercion is something that has other lines of protection that are inherently non-technical. It is relevant for beneficiaries, right? And I think, but the question for beneficiaries is, to what extent the humanitarian organization offer digital services to beneficiaries? And if we are to offer digital services to beneficiaries, what are the framework conditions that give any humanitarian actor the license to operate these beneficiary-centric digital services? And that's sort of a broader question, but deniability is not necessarily something that's even factored in at this point.
So I've been curious about plausible deniability for a technical angle for quite a while, and I'm still very curious about it. I have never really found a great use case for that that would translate well in practice. So in a sense, plausible deniability it's a subtle property. You can see that as an hyper property that shows that you cannot be sure that something actually happened, but you are leaking some information, knowing that it's either it's me or it's Shweta that did that is not a great privacy property for neither of us, right? And so if you can go for more technically extreme solutions, like if you go for cryptographic security, what you get is negligible probability of any information leaking about what you did or did not, and that's similar but much stronger than just the fact that you can find a scenario that shows that you are not in that loop. And similarly, if you look at privacy, anonymity set is, or it started maybe 20 years ago. Now we much prefer to have anonymity or pseudonymity or stronger, more robust guarantees, because if we aim just for plausible deniability, we might be missing some more brutal but just as effective technical solutions. The sort of dual property of non-repudiation is much more important in a sense. With transparency, we are getting there, and it provides a much stronger guarantees against some of the actors. And of course, we need to convince actors that we be held accountable, and that's an interesting question to have. But that's it's really not symmetrical. It's actually a very strong property that I think will have an impact of keeping people accountable for what they do, in particular reputable organizations and providers. Yes.
Okay, I think there was another question over there.
So first, thank you for the discussion, and it may be a bit of a provocative question, but do you think that if someone has data, he has to assume that at some point it will be compromised, and then what are the actions you think that the person having the data should do to minimize the consequences of this compromission?
Is that perhaps more technical question?
So, just to rephrase your question is if you are in a possession of data, it's inevitable that it's going to be compromised. One is, how do you reduce the chance of this happening, and if it happens, how do you reduce the impact of it? So one of the well worked out solutions has been to encrypt things, right? And the nice property it gives you is when you want to access the data, you have your key, so you can access it. And if someone else gets their hands on your data, they do have the data, but they don't have the key. Right? And this scales very well because you can quickly delete the key and make sure that no one else gets access to this data. Now, in practice, how well this works, the extreme example I like to give is, well, the most well-guarded secret you have is probably the keys for your cryptocurrency. Right? That's a piece of data you really don't want anyone else to get your hands on, and we've seen how difficult that problem is, right? So for a single key, how difficult it is to safeguard it. So yeah, do you want that data to be accessible all the time when you want to do your transactions? That's a difficult problem. Do you want to have that data accessible sometime, right? And most of the time you want to deny access? That's a relatively easy problem to solve. Now, in the cloud scenario, we also like to cite this three-layer problem, right? You want to protect the data at rest, while it is at use, and while it is at transit. So again, there you need three different solutions, right? When it's in transit, you need secure communication, so something like SSL, HTTPS. While it is at rest, you need, again, secure encryption, which again is commoditily available on your laptops and servers. The trickiest problem is when the data is in use, right? You have to decrypt things and you have to keep them in memory. And there the solution typically is either confidential computing using the hardware or the purely cryptographic way. You compute on data without ever encrypting it. So again, my stance on this is technically it's possible. The difficulty usually is the human interactions, right? When someone coerces you or you by mistake write your key down somewhere, then those are the scenarios where it's really humans need to sort of adapt to that. And again, the simple solutions are just use a password manager to reduce your chances, use good security practices like two-factor authentication and so on. Right? So that's the technical side of thing. I think what happens after your data is leaked, maybe Balthasar is the right.
Thank you. That was a really nice bridge. I think you owe me a beer for that one. No, but I think perhaps before I come to that, to avoid the question, I'll come back to it, is of course one of the key principles of data protection is actually also data minimization. So the question is already, what kind of data do you whatever data you haven't taken can't be stolen from you, can't be exfiltrated. So I think you have to be quite thoughtful about what data do you really need. And it's a real dilemma for humanitarians, We tend now to rather go for data minimization, but at the same time there is a discussion at the institution that would say, well, it would be so interesting to have more data, and that would allow us afterwards to make our response perhaps over time far more pertinent and impactful. So it's a dilemma. But careful about what you collect is a first step. Now, once data is breached, I think, and if I refer to the cyber attack that we have suffered and discovered in January, is really, I believe, especially for humanitarian actors, but also for others, it's a great transparency to basically say it happened. And it's also probably not trying to embellish it. So it's, of course, there is immediate, timely switching off of the systems, In our case, that was a system used by 61 national Red Cross and Red Crescent societies to reunite families. So you can imagine the complication to do that and to inform the stakeholders and to sequence that, even to be transparent about it. So be transparent about it. Don't embellish it, which in the sense communicate almost on the worst case basis. Think about the people. So of course that means trying to make a risk assessment for what does it actually mean for data subjects. The more you know what data has been exfiltrated, the more targeted can you be in terms of mitigating possible risks. So for a humanitarian actor, this is really about thinking through what could be the possible risks for people informing the data subjects. We have standards at ICSC, but we also try to impress upon the whole Red Cross and the Red Crescent movement, which is really a network of over 190 national societies. The Swiss Red Cross, the Yemeni Red Crescent, it's almost in each and every country of the world you have these national societies. In order that we can have common standards as a movement towards the data subjects. And I think Afterwards, it's also, and that's a bit musique de l'avenir, it's probably trying to think, how do you actually engage with the people who attack you? We have made also publicly clearly said that we will not pay money to get the data back. So we won't be blackmailed. That's the same thing if we have people who are taken hostages. And as I speak, we have colleagues who are taking hostages. We do not pay to have hostages released, because otherwise each and every of our 20,000 staff members would have a sort of $1 million sign written on the front head. It's just, it would be the end of our reach, and every staff member knows that. But I think it begs incredibly difficult question also if there was a ransomware attack. So I wouldn't now to go too much towards a tangent, but I think there is indeed transparency, but then also dialogue with the people who attack you, in the hope that you can convince them, as in the physical world, to abstain from attacking you in the first place. I think that will be absolutely essential. So I don't believe it can only be, for us, it's not a technological problem, it's essentially an operational, political problem. And we need, of course, to have the best technology available to mitigate and reduce the risks. Yeah, but I think it's a real concern, because you can really undermine humanitarian actors and the trust on which their access hinges. If we lose the trust of the people or of the belligerents, there will just simply no ICSC will be around. I think it could really break our neck. So we have to be as good as we can about it.
Cédric, you have a response?
Yeah, maybe a technical reaction to that is, sure, every secret can be leaked, but it doesn't mean that all secrets are equal. And so I think one of the big challenges is to actually to keep track of what is secret and what isn't, and you can have confidential data that is secret to some people but not others, and then you combine it together and then it becomes secret to everyone. So what is secret, and how to minimize what is secret, and how to apply the right technology or the right mitigations to which part of the secret is really important. For example, we mentioned cryptographic keys, and in a sense, cryptography is all about reducing having to protect the data to having to protect the keys, which at some level is pointless. At another, if you just have to protect a master key, then you can do have custom hardware and super expensive techniques, and you can split the secret into dozens of bits that you need to compromise at the same time, and you can erase the secret after a while. You can, even as mentioned earlier, you can refresh your secret on every day and then erase it or scrub it. So there is, so yes, every secret, you should understand in your model what happens if each of the secrets get leaked, but typically there will be many cases and many threat models, and for each of those there may be technologies that may help there or not. It's not, indeed all secrets are vulnerable, but it doesn't mean we shouldn't try to have a specific solution to the most secret or what is known to be problematic. Yes.
I also just wonder whether that might be a point to talk about homomorphic encryption. I know that is sometimes, of course, raised as a potential solution, but do you have some assessment?
Sure, yes. So yes, I guess it's a great example of that. So you can have techniques like multi-party computations or homomorphic encryptions, and they provide very strong guarantees. So of course, it's always within the model, but you have a theorem that says that no things get leaked out of it unless you have the decryption keys. But so it's a great way of reducing the risk, but unless someone has the key to decrypt, you are not going anywhere with that. So again, it shifts the problem, and it may provide more sophistication and reduce the risk, but it's not going to make it completely disappear. I think it's a great use case, because for homomorphic encryption, that's something you can do for some of your computation, but not all of it. So if it's linear, it's great. If it's dynamic and you want to run an arbitrary script, it's a disaster in terms of performance. So it means splitting the data using different software stacks. In some cases that's great, but in general, if you want to do machine learning, for example, it's going to be tough. So it's a complicated trade-off. Yes.
Okay, I just realized that we are, our session is about AI systems, and we've been discussing more sort of basic data systems. So perhaps just raising it up a level using AI and data scenarios. So I was particularly thinking for the International Red Cross, are there sort of scenarios or applications in AI that you think are unthinkable to support, even with making lots of progress on the technology and policy side? I wonder, Balthasar, whether you have any.
I mean, I would sort of draw a distinction between how we think about using artificial intelligence to solve certain issues, operational issues, and perhaps artificial intelligence and warfare. And if I just give, without, for want of time, too many examples, but one example is where typically we want to really push the use of artificial intelligence is the matching of identities of missing people. Very often, and you have fuzzy information where you have certain elements. It can be a picture, it can be a first name, it can be a date of origin, but with different spellings, and of course you can do digital matching of identities with these elements, and machine learning that really helps us, and I think that's an excellent example among many where artificial intelligence can actually really help us to have humanitarian impact and find people that we currently just would not find because the systems are too dumb to make these matches, or it would just take such manual work to sift through lists and test hypotheses that it's impossible. So suddenly you can find people who otherwise would not find each other. And I think there's a number of other examples that we can't go through where certainly artificial intelligence, machine learning will provide really humanitarian impact, and we would be irresponsible to deprive us of these possibilities. Now, if we look at artificial intelligence and warfare, what of course one key concern is the use of autonomous weapons, and Ed alluded to it in his introductory remarks. So the very idea that you basically cut free a system intent to damage or kill, and that system has then a sort of self-learning capacity or a certain target pattern, and then goes off and wages war, poses a number of ethical, legal, moral, operational challenges. And we have taken last year the position as an institution to basically say we need to have norms on the use of autonomous weapons. So we have come out in favor of having binding legal norms on the use of autonomous weapons. And we also clearly, as Ed said, believe that AD systems should not be used against persons. And B, that we have to, I mean, there's far more conditions, but that we need to have an element of human control in it. We cannot just let these systems go and kill on their own. It's for us highly problematic. It would also, of course, raise interesting questions. If a system suddenly, kills a group of civilians, who has committed the war crime? Is it the software developer, you, or is it you who are the military commander who authorized that system, or you who own the company and who develops that program? So I think you can imagine the kind of dilemmas that we would see. I'm not even sure you would see humanitarian actors. I mean, if you are in a war system where you have self-learning systems, I mean, most of ICRC staff, they constantly, for instance, have to operationally talk to belligerents, which means belligerents can be states and capitals or armed forces, but it can also, in many of the modern wars, can be really the armed groups. I mean, they control population. You have to talk to everybody. So my behavior pattern, if I'm in the field, is that I'm constantly in contact with groups. So so the chance that the AI system would sort of basically say, well, this Balthasar guy, really statistically, he seems to spend an awful lot with military commanders of Al-Qaeda. So take him out.
Any other response to that question? I think then we have about 10 minutes, so it would be time for another audience question. Something comes
Just one question about weapons, about autonomous weapons. Sorry, about autonomous weapons. I understand the idea to say human in control, but now it's the same most companies, which is not with weapons, but are also always saying, we deploy AI, but there is a human in the loop. So the UI provides recommendations and everything, and it's also always a human who decides. It's not often that we let the horses ride for free in important decisions. But my question is, and if we look at the research, for example, that DARPA is doing in the US, because they are very concerned about the usage of AI in weapons, the human in control is no answer, because actually what we have today already on the field is many things which are neither black nor white. I mean, if an autonomous system recommends the soldier, this is a target, shoot, I say there is no civilians or such thing, and we have a human who's doing it. We're not working it's not an abstraction. On the field, maybe the soldier will be punished if maybe he has no time to take a decision. Maybe he will be punished if he went against the recommendation of the engine and so on. So how are you dealing with all this gray thing, which is not fully autonomous weapons, but still AI used in warfare?
Okay, that's interesting. And just the thought of that, a self-driving car, of course, can be used as a weapon. And I know Brad Smith, our president, he wrote this book, Tools and Weapons, that because technology can be used in both ways. Would you like to immediately respond? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I'll pass it back to Balthasar afterwards. I hear you, but in a way, the one thing we always question from a policy perspective and a governance perspective is whether advances in technology require new norms or whether existing norms are sufficient. And the one thing that's extremely important from the humanitarian perspective is that we do have a normative framework that exists today. It's called the Geneva Conventions. We are fortunate that it exists today. There is no scenario on Earth in which ex nihilo we would create an equivalent framework today if it did not already exist, right? So there is a very strong incentive in ensuring and having interpretations of existing frameworks, existing conventions, existing protocols, the additional protocols, to new technology without creating new normative norms. It's uncommon for ICRC to say this new type of weapon should be banned because the threshold is that it's a new type of weapon. So an autonomous weapon that would automatically make kill decision based on a pre-programmed pattern fighting either against other autonomous weapons, civilians, infrastructure, and so forth, is arguably new. A soldier making decision based on intelligence, right, is not that's not necessarily new, right? And so certainly there is a legal argument that basically the soldier that makes the decision and the chain of command that makes the decision is accountable for any crimes that might be committed if there's the threshold of the standards of the war crimes are met. How you get the information, whether the information is correct or not, this is in a way incremental evolutions of technology, but not something that requires a change in the normative framework. And certainly that's the bias in the thinking, is to try to always go back to the core principles, because the principles of humanity have not changed fundamentally by technology, unless technology fundamentally changes the game, which has been the case for a few very well identified classes of weapons over the past century or so.
Yes, no, I think I mean, it's very rare that weapons are banned before you use them. The blinding laser weapon is one of the few examples that came to mind where actually states basically said we will not deploy it, and it was banned before it was ever used. But I think on the autonomous weapons, just to say, we basically say we have international law that gives a number of clear rules, and we have just to smartly apply those, which is not always easy, but these rules should not be pushed aside. And on autonomous weapons specifically, we believe there is a need to have new norms, because the current norms need to be built upon, and then we have a whole list of conditions under which we think in these new norms to be developed that should always be more than we have, of course. So it should add on existing laws and not push those existing laws away. We basically say it should not be used against persons. There should be an element of human control. It should be very much limited in terms of scope and space and criteria. So it's quite a narrow usage case, but we do not say as ICSC that we currently call for a norm that would totally ban any kind of autonomous weapon systems. I think that's perhaps the nuance. It probably doesn't totally answer your question in terms of the subtleties of weapon systems which already use partly artificial intelligence but are under the threshold of what often is referred to as autonomous weapons. And I think their international law principles and the letter applies and needs to be faithfully applied. But it's very much then a case-by-case discussion on how that would play out.
From the technical side, the way I see this question is, are you ready to take responsibility for the decision you made with the help of this AI system? And I think that is a good technical problem which is unsolved today, right? We like to call it AI explainability, right? You want to know why this system is recommending what it's recommending. And if you are given more context, right, which the system said, do this because I inferred X and Y and Z, then it at least gives more autonomy to the human in the loop, right? Then there is accountability. Then it says, oh, it told me these things which I could quickly check, and that's why I took this decision. Now, that is a difficult technical problem, not just in weapons, but even in self-driving cars, right? Why is the car telling me to stop when it sees a red poster on the car in front of me, right? Oh, it's treating it as a stop sign. So I think those are good technical problems which we are trying to solve, and it gets more complicated than that, right? So in weapons, perhaps you can train the AI system on controlled data. But in cars or jointly learned models, you could have adversaries poisoning your data sets and trying to coerce your models and mistraining them on things you don't even know that it's doing. And again, their explainability helps, because then even if someone tried to attack your AI system and mistrain, let's say, your robot or your car, you at least know that this doesn't match reality and it's trying to mispredict something. So fortunately, that is an active area of research. Unfortunately, the jury is not out on that yet. It's a hairy problem.
Okay, thank you very much. And perhaps final thought, Cédric, because I think I realize we need to wrap up.
Yeah, I'm not sure it's an appropriate analogy, but a similar situation with machine learning and decision making is for medical treatment. And in fact, initially people quite naively thought, okay, we are going to use an AI system to decide or to make diagnostics, and it's still probably a terrible idea, except in very specific circumstances for many reasons. Many of them are technical, others are just human and the way medical system works today, right? And so I think focusing on providing assistance, something that is going to do some automating, segmenting or coloring, or providing quantitative analysis, is it 3%, is it 4% growth, this kind of data, and providing elements, data, quantitative data, more useful data to someone who is actually in charge of making the decision makes a lot of sense, and it's a much more technically reasonable problem to handle first, I think. Conversely, I think making sure there is a human loop is a great principle to have for weapon systems. Of course, it's not a solution, but at least it seems very useful to begin with. Yes.
Okay, thank you very much. I realize that brings us to the end of the time and the session. I mean, obviously not to the end of the topic, because it's very clear that on this interface between policy and technology, there's much more to come. And we are very fortunate and looking forward to exploring some of these issues, of course, in our research collaboration. But yeah, thank you very much to all the panelists for your contributions and great discussion. And of course, thank you all for coming and engaging in the Q&A as well. Thanks a lot.